In 1913, Dawson wrote, "Upon one of my subsequent visits to the pit, one of the men handed me a small portion of an unusually thick human parietal bone. I immediately made a search but could find nothing more. It was not until some years later, in the autumn of 1911, on a visit to the spot, that I picked up, among the rain-washed spoil heaps of the gravel pit, another and larger piece belonging to the frontal region of the same skull." Dawson noted that the pit contained pieces of flint much the same in color as the skull fragments. Dawson was not a simple amateur. He had been elected a Fellow of the Geological Society and for 30 years had contributed specimens to the British Museum as an honorary collector. Furthermore, he had cultivated a close friendship with Sir Arthur Smith Woodward, keeper of the Geological Department at the British Museum and a Fellow of the Royal Society. In February of 1912, Dawson wrote a letter to Woodward at the British Museum telling him how he had come across a very old Pleistocene bed, which I think is going to be very interesting, with a part of a thick human skull in it. Altogether, Dawson had found 5 pieces of the skull. In order to harden them, he soaked them in a solution of potassium dichromate.
To keep them from
crumbling into dust.
Into dust?
That's right.
Okay.
On Saturday, June 2nd of 1912, Woodward and Dawson, accompanied by Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, a student at a local Jesuit seminary, so he's a student at this point. Piltdown Man was his first one, I think. The Java excavations were later.
Okay.
So they began excavations at Piltdown and were rewarded with some new discoveries. On the very first day, they found another piece of skull. More followed. Dawson later wrote, "Apparently, the whole or greater portion of the human skull had been shattered by the workmen, who had thrown away the pieces unnoticed. Of these, we recovered from the spoil heaps as many fragments as possible. In a somewhat deeper depression of the undisturbed gravel, I found the right half of a human mandible. So far as I could judge, guiding myself by the position of a tree 3 or 4 yards away, the spot was identical with that upon which the men were at work when the first portion of the cranium was found several years ago. Dr. Woodward also dug up a small portion of the occipital bone of the skull from within a yard of the point where the jaw was discovered, and at precisely the same level. The jaw appeared to have been broken at the symphysis and abraded, perhaps when it lay fixed in the gravel and before its complete deposition. The fragments of the cranium show little or no sign of rolling or other abrasion, save an incision at the back of the parietal, probably caused by a workman's pick. A total of 9 fossil skull pieces were found, 5 by Dawson alone, and an additional 4 after Woodward joined the excavation. In addition to the human fossils, the excavations at Piltdown yielded a variety of mammalian fossils, including teeth of elephant, mastodon, horse, and beaver. Stone tools were also found, some comparable to eoliths and others of more advanced workmanship. Some of the tools and mammalian fossils were more worn than the others. Dawson and Woodward believed that the tools and bones in better condition, including the Piltdown Man fossils, dated to the early Pleistocene, while the others had originally been part of a Pliocene formation. In the decades that followed, many scientists agreed with Dawson and Woodward that the Piltdown Man fossils belonged with the early Pleistocene mammal fossils, contemporary with the Piltdown gravels. Others, such as Sir Arthur Keith and A.T. Hopwood, thought the Piltdown Man fossils belonged with the older late Pliocene fauna that had apparently been washed into the Piltdown gravels from an older horizon. From the beginning, the Piltdown skull was deemed morphologically human-like. According to Woodward, the early ape-like ancestors of humans had a human-like skull, but an ape-like jaw, like that of Piltdown Man. At a certain point, said Woodward, the evolutionary line split. One branch began to develop thick skulls with big brow ridges. This line led to Java Man and Neanderthals, who had thick skulls with big brow ridges. Another line retained the smooth-browed skull while the jaw became more human-like, and this is the line in which anatomically modern humans appeared. Woodward had thus come up with his own theory about human evolution, which he wanted to support by fossil evidence, however limited and fragmentary. Today, a version of Woodward's proposed lineage survives in the widely accepted idea that Homo sapiens sapiens and Homo sapiens neanderthalis are both descendants of a species called archaic or early Homo sapiens. Not at all widely accepted, but quite close to Woodward's idea, is Louis Leakey's proposal that both Homo erectus and the Neanderthals are side branches from the main line of human evolution. But all of these proposed evolutionary lineages ignore the evidence cataloged in this book for the presence of anatomically modern humans in periods earlier than the Pleistocene. Not everyone agreed with the idea that the Piltdown jaw and skull belonged to the same creature. Sir Ray Lancaster of the British Museum suggested they might belong to a separate creature of different species. David Watterson, professor of anatomy at King's College, also thought the jaw did not belong to the skull. He said that connecting the jaw with the skull was akin to linking a chimpanzee's foot with a human leg. If Watterson was correct, he was confronted with a skull that appeared to be very much like that of a human and was quite possibly from the early Pleistocene. So right from the start, some experts were uncomfortable with the seeming incompatibility between the human-like skull and the ape-like jaw of the Piltdown man. Sir Grafton Elliott Smith, an expert in brain physiology, tried to diffuse this doubt. After examining a cast showing the features of the brain cavity of the Piltdown skull, Smith wrote, "We must consider this as being the most primitive and most simian human brain so far recorded. One, moreover, such as might reasonably have been expected to be associated in one and the same individual with the ape-like mandible. But, according to modern scientists, the Piltdown skull is a fairly recent Homo sapiens sapiens skull that was planted by a hoaxer. If we accept this, that means Smith, a renowned expert, was seeing simian features where none factually existed." So see, this is why this is interesting, because it gets complicated here. Like this guy, Sir Grafton Elliott Smith, was an expert in brain physiology and morphology of skulls. And back when there was still controversy over whether the jaw belonged to the skull or not, but not whether it was authentic, he was like, look, even if this, this skull that we're connecting the jaw to has a tiny brain, which in his mind makes it archaic. And so he was thinking, like, this is why we can say, even though it looks really like a modern human skull, the morphology gives it a really small brain, so connecting it with this jaw is not that big of a deal. It has simian features, in other words. But now they consider that the Piltdown skull as a hoax, and that the skull part is actually a modern Homo sapiens sapiens head.
What?
Yeah. So it's like...
So was it like a child's
I don't know.
skull or something?
He says, the guy said, we must consider this as being the most primitive and simian human brain so far recorded. But now it's considered to be a modern Homo sape skull that was part of a hoax.
That is weird. Yeah.
So was he just seeing what he wanted to see? Or, this is why it's interesting.
Yeah.
The other question is the skull actually a modern Homo sapiens sapiens skull? And it actually belongs in that ancient, it's the jaw that's the problem. And the problem with that is that if it's a modern skull, but it was in that ancient, anatomically modern skull, but it's associated with that ancient bed, then that puts, like they're saying, modern humans all the way back at this time, this like early Pleistocene stuff. So it was hoped that future discoveries would clarify the exact status of Piltdown man. The canine teeth, which are more pointed in the apes than in human beings, were missing from the Piltdown jaw. Woodward thought a canine would eventually turn up, and even made a model of how a Piltdown man canine should look. On August 29th, 1913, Deschardins did in fact find a canine tooth in a heap of gravel at the Piltdown excavation site, near the place where the mandible had been uncovered. The point of the tooth was worn and flattened like that of a human canine, and some nose bones were also found. So the Jesuit guy finds the tooth.
Did it look just like the guy's prediction?
Yeah. By this time, Piltdown had become quite a tourist attraction. Visiting researchers were politely allowed to assist in the ongoing excavations. Motor coaches came with members of natural history societies. Dawson even had a picnic lunch at the Piltdown site for the Geological Society of London. Soon, Dawson achieved celebrity status. Indeed, the scientific name for the Piltdown hominid became Eoanthropus dawsoni, meaning Dawson's dawn man. But Dawson's enjoyment of his fame was short-lived. He died in 1916. Doubts persisted that the jaw and skull of Eoanthropus belonged to the same creature, but these doubts weakened when Woodward reported the discovery in 1915 of a second set of fossils about 2 miles from the original Piltdown site. Found there were 2 pieces of human skull and a human-like molar tooth. For many scientists, the Piltdown 2 discoveries helped establish that the original Piltdown skull and jaw belonged to the same individual. But as more hominid fossils were found, the Piltdown fossil, with its Homo sapiens type of cranium, introduced a great deal of uncertainty into the construction line of human evolution. At Beijing, researchers initially uncovered a primitive-looking jaw resembling that of Piltdown Man, but when the first Beijing Man skull was uncovered in 1929, it had the low forehead and pronounced brow ridge of Pithecanthropus of Java, now classified with Beijing Man as Homo Erectus. So yeah, the problem there is they're, they've got the same looking jaw as Piltdown Man, but it's connected to this. Yeah, it's connected to this totally different kind of skull. In the same decade, Raymond Dart uncovered the first Australopithecus specimens in Africa. Other Australopithecus finds followed, and like Java Man and Beijing Man, they also had low foreheads and prominent brow ridges. Most British anthropologists, however, decided that Australopithecus was an ape-like creature that was not a human ancestor. But after World War II, new finds by Robert Broom in Africa led the British to change their minds about Australopithecus, accepting it as a human ancestor. So now, what was to be done with Piltdown Man, who was thought to be as old as the Australopithecus finds that had by then been made? Meanwhile, an English dentist named Alvin Marston kept badgering British scientists about Piltdown Man, contending that something was not quite right about the fossils. In 1935, Marston discovered a human skull at Swanscombe, accompanied by fossil bones of 26 kinds of Middle Pleistocene animals. Desiring that his discovery be hailed as the oldest Englishman, Marston challenged the age of the Piltdown fossils. In 1949, Marston convinced Kenneth P. Oakley of the British Museum to test both the Swanscombe and Piltdown fossils with the newly developed fluorine content method. The Swanscombe skull had the same fluorine content as the fossil animal bones found at the same site, thus confirming its Middle Pleistocene antiquity. The test results for the Piltdown specimens were more confusing. Oakley, it should be mentioned, apparently had his own suspicions about Piltdown Man. Oakley and Hoskins, co-authors of the 1950 fluorine content test report, wrote that the anatomical features of Eoanthropus, which is what they were calling Piltdown, assuming the material represent one creature, are wholly contrary to what discoveries in the Far East and in Africa had led us to expect in an early Pleistocene hominid. Oakley tested the Piltdown fossils in order to determine whether the cranium and the jaw of Piltdown Man really belonged together. The fluorine content of 4 of the original Piltdown cranial bones ranged from 0.1 to 0.4%. The jaw yielded a fluorine content of 0.2%, suggesting that it does belong with the skull. The bones from the second Piltdown locality gave similar results. Oakley concluded that the Piltdown bones were from the Riss worm interglacial, which would make them between 75,000 and 125,000 years old. This is quite a bit more recent than the early Pleistocene date originally ascribed to the Piltdown fossils, but it is still anomalously old for a skull of the fully human type in England. According to current theory, Homo sapiens sapiens arose in Africa about 100,000 years ago and only much later migrated to Europe at 30,000 years ago.
This has changed, right?
Yes, yeah. Not much, but yes, it's changed. Yeah, 40,000 years ago now, I think, is what the earliest accepted, and that's from, in Europe. But yeah, I think Homo sapiens sapiens arising maybe 200,000 to 300,000 years ago in Africa is what is more accepted now. But yeah, I would say probably 125,000 years for a Homo sape in Europe is too old.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oakley's report did not entirely satisfy Marston, the dentist, who was convinced